Hello everyone, my name is Tamiwa Aladikomo and this is The Next Wave by TechCabal. On the last episode, we talked about talent, all the factors affecting the local talent pipeline in Africa, and what it means for the present and next generation of Africa startups. Our topic for today lies at the heart of a problem that nearly every African is familiar with: Africa's rapidly growing population and the need for innovation in urban planning. Our guests today will be sharing their thoughts on why it's important for us to shift our focus towards what is typically considered a traditional sector, and some of the more interesting theories on how to think about cities and smart cities in Africa. Today, I have two people who are going to bring a critical perspective on the conversation. I'm talking with Iyin Aboyeji, co-founder of Talent City, a new project aimed at creating a hub for African tech talent to build the future, and Jonathan Hursh, who's the founding partner at Utopia, a platform for urban tech entrepreneurs in emerging cities across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Thank you both for joining us. I'll kick off the conversation with you, Iyin. The idea of smart cities started to take root about a decade ago, but there was some initial skepticism about them, even from urban planners. Part of the concern, of course, was that they'd end up being accessible only to the elite. So to start with, what's your general sense of smart cities in Africa? Are they a context-appropriate solution for the continent? Why do they make sense?
I believe that smart cities are a little bit of a misnomer because cities are by definition smart. If they weren't smart, people wouldn't live in them. However, I think that the cities of the future, which is what most people are asking for, are cities that are bringing together three very important elements. The first is obviously they're bringing a sense of community with people who share similar values and outlook on life with you, and people want to live near people who share their outlook of life. The second thing is people want to be near critical infrastructure. And for the new generation of young people who are in the world of work, the most critical piece of infrastructure is broadband, not even electricity. And so people want to live in places that have those amenities and more. They're secure, they have broadband, they have electricity, they have water, and they're designed especially for them. They have cultural activities, they have sports activities. And most importantly, people want to live in cities where policies are designed to help them thrive in whatever it is their chosen profession is. And so with that in mind, I think that perhaps there's a need to redefine smart cities, because the context within which smart cities are typically used is in the context of just the brick and mortar infrastructure. And that's why the only people who can have an opinion on it are urban planners. But the reality is that the building cities of the future is more or less a community effort, and it's a lot less about the bricks and mortar, and far more about the people and the communities and the policies that are being designed to help them thrive.
Okay, that's great. As of 2018, 54% of Africans lived in slums. So there's clearly an urban development challenge. What would you say is the way forward in solving this challenge, and what's the right and the wrong way to think about it?
I think the first thing to keep in mind is where those people came from. They came from villages, and I think urbanization is a force for global good, because urbanization helps people live fairly more modern lives. It makes them closer to economic opportunity. It allows them access to some amenities, including public transportation and running water, and all the things that we know urban life to be. And to be honest, it's actually fairly different from the agrarian life that's in the village. Unfortunately, I think the lack of planning is what has created the disaster that urban planning is today, or urbanization has become in Africa today. And that lack of planning is still what bedevils the industry. So the places you call slums are spaces that can be properly organized to help people just have basic dwellings. They don't have to be high-end. They just have to be simple middle-class dwellings. And if I were to take on those problems, I'm thinking along the lines of, first of all, formalizing titles. A lot of the families in those quote unquote slums, if they had right to title, would be able to borrow against their title, at least to the extent that is possible, to be able to build more befitting residences. It would be easier for the state to plan for infrastructure to be embedded in the community. It would be easier to figure out, who's had access to education, who needs access to healthcare, what kind of capacity should we be designing for. So I think the first thing is formalizing what we are calling slums and thinking of them as urban dwellings, and essentially, according them the respect that we give to middle class urban dwellers, right? Allowing them formalize their land, allowing them be registered as part of the system, as opposed to treating them like they're squatters in the middle of a mess.
Okay, so that's a fascinating way to look at it. I think the community focus and the values focus is quite interesting. But moving on, investors are always looking for new spaces to invest in. Urban development is an important area, but it's very capital intensive. So it's not the sexiest area for tech investors. How do we make it attractive for investment?
I think a lot of attention needs to be put there. I always tell my investor colleagues, you can't build something on nothing. And I think for a lot of us, maybe in the rush to get the Silicon Valley funding, or because of a lack of foresight, we've actually ignored the more foundational pieces of the economy, for what I call apps and APIs. And I think we need to go back to the fundamentals. And one of the fundamentals, obviously, is how do people live, right? And there's a lot of things to be innovated around that. How do you make communities more walkable? How do you make them safe? How do you innovate community healthcare? How do you innovate security within a community? How do you innovate, deliveries and logistics within a community without any addresses? For a very long time, we've been importing Western responses to those questions, without really doing a lot of deep thinking and innovation ourselves, which could create jobs and really build something that can scale across the continent. And I think that now is the time for people to now start looking in that direction and asking themselves, what kind of innovations are needed in these quote unquote slums, or what kind of innovations are needed in these cities to enable them to thrive. And I think the answers to that would be extremely valuable $1 billion companies. For us, we've begun to invest along those lines, but it's very difficult to find co-travelers on that journey because, a lot of investors have kind of been educated to believe that anything that involves brick and mortar is evil and not going to make money, and it's patently untrue, right? Venture capital is not just about writing code; it's about solving problems, and sometimes the problems you need to solve require you to put some cement on the ground and and handle a construction site. And I think more companies need to get familiar and comfortable with that pattern of investment.
There have been a wave of smart city initiatives in the past with projects in Kenya, Rwanda, Ghana, and Nigeria, among others. How successful have these been, and where have they gone wrong? What is Talent City going to do differently, and how do we get it right this time?
Yeah, I think for me, at the end of the day, the city of the future would require quite a lot of work from a prototyping perspective. And I fear that there is no space to prototype, the kind of cities that young people who will, in the future, mainly work on the internet need to live in. We're at Talent City, we're daring greatly to build that kind of environment where, the entire DNA of the city is innovation. And it's interesting. We're succeeding, but also sometimes we're being misunderstood. But I'm very excited to see what happens when we get to the point where people realize that it's really, really, really going to be interesting, to be able to have a space where you can model different elements of city life, from transportation to food production to to defense and security, to internet connectivity, and so on and so forth. If you think about some of the biggest thriving cities, even in Africa today, most of them are built around religious living, right? So you look at Canaan Land, you look at Redemption Camp. These are entire cities, thousands and thousands of hectares of land that are not designed around any commercial imperative, but are really just designed around similar religious values. And I think if you extrapolate that, you find that you will then start to see the color of a city come through when you can start to think about it from a values perspective. From a talent city perspective, we're designing a city that's for the builders of tomorrow. And so as we think about every aspect of the city, we're thinking about, who are the builders of tomorrow? Who are the people who support the builders of tomorrow? And then trying to make sure that we have a city that pertains to that. I think the false choice, though, is to believe that a city either has to be exclusionist or a city has to be completely democratic. And I don't think those extremes are helpful. I think there is a third way, and that third way is really to design a city with people who share your values.
This is a really useful perspective, Iyin. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to go on a short commercial break. When we return, we're going to continue the conversation with Jonathan Hursh. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, and thanks for staying with us. We're on with Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan. How are you doing?
Hi there. Good to see you.
Good to see you. So, Jonathan, in your opinion, what is the case for smart cities in Africa? Do you consider them a contextually relevant solution for this continent?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of conversation these years about smart cities, and it has its place. But I've also been on the hunt for what we might call the wise city. I think the smart city conversation so far has been dominated by technology, in some ways rightfully so, by smart technology. But technology sometimes has a way of, it can diminish our society, and other technology can free up our society to make us more human. And we want the tech that actually amplifies our humanity and our societies in a way that we've not seen in the past. And so I think that Africa has a really unique opportunity, given the culture, given the dynamics, given the rate of dizzying growth there, has an opportunity to recapture and redefine what smart cities actually could look like for the world. Where when it comes to technology, which has dominated the conversation, that is technology that recedes and embeds in our society, becomes almost invisible, and we're focusing on things that make us more human. And when we talk about the future of cities, I really think that we're talking about the future of our societies, not just what we want to build, what we want to do, but who we want to become. And if we see cities as really the arena to build the next era of civilization or the next era of society, cities are the best place to do this because of the rapid change, because it's where decisions are being made on a daily basis. It's where we're tackling some of humanity's greatest challenges around climate change, around inequality. A lot of these decisions get made at the city level. And so I think that, with a mindset that we redefine smart cities as being beyond technology, I think that Africa can actually lead the way for the world.
You talked about using technology to enhance our humanity. What does that look like in a smart city?
Le Corbusier, an urban planner back last century, I think he got it wrong. Cities aren't machines, they're organisms. I read somewhere once that our subconscious operates at 72 times faster than our conscious. And so there's a lot going on in the pulse of the city that's naturally happening already. And I think that we can try to be a bit more humble in how we listen to the pulse of the city and begin to wrap our solutions around that. Entrepreneurs have an amazing role to play. I think obviously governments have a key role to play in the future of our cities. I think corporations have a key role to continue to play. Developers have a key role to play. But this really, I think, is the era of the entrepreneur and bringing decentralized solutions that are much more in touch with how we live our human lives on a daily basis than we've seen in the past.
Interesting. You talked about the role of government. Now, in a number of cities, we've seen smart city initiatives. So the Nigerian Smart City Initiative, the Rwandan Smart Africa Blueprint. How successful would you say these initiatives are? Do they make sense? Do they work?
I'm a fan, I'm a proponent of 100 different types of approaches towards improving our cities. And I think smart cities are one of those approaches. I think that where it can become even more successful than what we've seen in the last 10 years is when they begin to move maybe more from these meta systems, these macro systems in the city, and then also begin to introduce more micro systems and decentralized systems. And I think, again, that partnering with the entrepreneurial community to bring some of those decentralized solutions in that are much more adaptive, much more able to be upgraded on a short time scale is something that can make this overall blueprint of smart cities in Africa much more effective.
Are there any examples of those micro interventions that you find interesting or positive you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, a city, the exciting thing to think about with cities in this century is cities are not just made up of infrastructure. And I think smart cities have traditionally looked at how do we address infrastructure in these cities, and rightfully so. I mean, 2/3 of African cities' infrastructure and services have yet to be built. 2/3. I think Africa has 17 of the 20 fastest growing cities around the world. I think that Africa is going to end up with 13 out of the 17 or 20 largest cities in the world, increase in 80% urban population over the next few decades. Lagos will become the largest city in the world within several decades at 88 million people, is projected. And so we don't really know what that size of a city really looks and feels like. And so I think that the opportunity to bring in these more decentralized solutions across all systems in a city. So back to the prior point, I think smart cities have traditionally looked at the infrastructure of a city and how do you tackle that. But a city is made up of so many systems, almost any systems you can imagine, healthcare systems and education systems and energy systems. And so there's an opportunity to see how do you, for an entrepreneur, how to use technology, emerging technology to improve the educational access in a city? How do you use emerging technology to increase healthcare access across a city? With energy, do we need massive grids across a city that tend to fail altogether at once? Or can microgrids be set up across different neighborhoods within the city? And I think that when you break down the city, we started years ago, we started as our human species with villages, and then we moved to cities, and then we moved to countries. And sometimes when we get to too large of a scale, it begins to, the things that make up a healthy, vibrant community, the sharing that happens within the community, the trust that happens within the community, some of that begins to break down. And so I think that I would advocate for, if I was running a smart city initiative, I would advocate for also looking at communities of 10,000 people blocks. And can you create an energy microgrid across a 10,000 person block or neighborhood? Can you create an integrated healthcare system across that block? Can you create an integrated education system across that block? And so I think the danger perhaps has been is that smart city efforts have concentrated almost the entirety of the effort at the entire city scale, when actually maybe it should be a bit more of a modular approach that operates at the human scale, at the neighborhood scale, at the block scale. And then the next 20 or 30%, the last 20 or 30% is how you tie these different blocks together into an integrated system. I don't think that everything needs to be integrated at the city level. A lot needs to be integrated at the block level.
How different from traditional city planning is this approach in your opinion?
Smart cities initiatives, I think they focus primarily on embedding technology.
Rather than smart city initiatives, I'm talking about this sort of microgrid approach to thinking about cities and providing services. How different is that from sort of traditional city planning in your perspective?
Yeah, I think in some ways it comes full circle. When a city is smaller, things happen at the block level or at the neighborhood level. And then as the city scales, things to become more efficient, the decision making and the integrated planning happens at a higher level. And so I think the direction that we can head is bringing it back to the block level or to the neighborhood level, and whether it's size of 10,000 people or 1,000 people, probably 10,000 people, 25,000 people, 100,000 people. I think that's not being done as effectively today as it could be.
It's a really interesting approach. I think radical in some ways, although it probably goes back to some traditional sort of like thinking around livable and walkable cities and building services around those. I guess when you think about the cities of the future across Africa, smart cities or whatever else you call them, what are the biggest obstacles to building better cities from your perspective on the continent?
Yeah, governance and is probably less down to good ideas and down to governance and resource. And so government has an enabling role to play in creating an environment that entrepreneurs, startups, corporations can thrive in bringing more decentralized solutions. And I think that the resource on the continent in the past has been constrained. As people begin to understand, as financiers begin to understand that, it's not in the terms of millions, but billions that are getting added into our urban populations, that I think that resource equation will begin to change. And so, we need the macro level national resource projects to be deployed, whether it be Africa 50 or World Bank. We also need funds to be deployed. That's one of the things that Utopia, my company, is working on, is to try to resource more entrepreneurs. And we question who are the next 10,000, 100,000 entrepreneurs that are going to be building urban tech startups that can improve quality of living in their cities across Asia, Africa, Latin America. And so I think governance and resource really are the constraints that we see at this moment. But as we all observe, I think Africa the continent is at a tipping point on this. And I'm extremely encouraged when we look into the future.
So Jonathan, final question. What's the outlook for smart cities in Africa and for better cities in Africa? What are the key factors that we need to succeed?
Yeah, I think two things that can really, three things to really emphasize moving forward. One is that Africa has an amazing and unique, the continent has a unique perspective in the world. It's growing at dizzying speeds. The cities are not yet calcified. And I think they really have a chance to show us what a more human smart city might look like, what a more human city might look like, more wise city might look like, and take a fundamentally different path, and involving philosophers and creatives and culturalists in that conversation, so that we end up with who we want to become, not just what we want to do, but who we want to become. And I think that Africa has the opportunity to really play a leadership role globally on that the rest of the world can learn from. I think the second is to emphasize public-private partnerships, which are really critical at this scale. Recently, Utopia partnered with the World Economic Forum's Center for Urban Transformation platform, which is doing a wonderful job at focusing on public-private partnerships. And we ran this Global Urban Innovation Challenge across 8 cities in Africa, Asia, Latin America, with 8 mayors, 8 venture capitalist communities, 8 entrepreneurial communities. And it's a chance to really bring together the different perspectives. City has its role to play in creating an enabling environment and the right incentives for other actors to bring forward decentralized solutions. I think that the venture capitalists and larger funds, financing firms have a role to play in pushing billions of dollars behind these urban tech efforts to improve quality of living, and not just in infrastructure, but also across healthcare systems in cities and education systems in cities and whatnot. I think entrepreneurs have a key role to play in bringing more decentralized solutions at the maybe block level or the neighborhood level than we've seen in the past. And one of the ways that Utopia is supporting that effort is we're building this network of city labs, which are urban tech venture studios, to help entrepreneurs across these cities build and back startups that can improve quality of living in their cities. And so I think that those 3 things take a more human approach, maybe even a more philosophical approach. I think the second is emphasizing public-private partnerships in ways that we might not seen in the past as much. And the third is really getting behind the entrepreneurial community and the entrepreneur as a key change maker in the future of what our cities become, because they're becoming something really intriguing and amazing. And I'm intensely curious about what our cities become as they double in size, as they triple in size, sometimes quadruple in size, just in the next few decades. And I think that we are at this inflection point. There's a once in a many generation opportunity to click in place systems that are fairer, that are healthier, that are at a more right. And what gets clicked in place in the next 20, 30 years will reverberate. The consequences of that will reverberate probably for the next 100, 200, maybe even 300 years in these cities. So it's a really exciting time.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us with a truly interesting perspective, Jonathan. With that, we've come to the end of today's episode. Thank you everyone for joining us. Special thanks to our guests, Iyin Aboyeji and Jonathan Hursh. Join us next week when we talk about the rise of Africa's super apps. If you want to share your thoughts with us on this episode, you can tweet at us using the hashtag #TheNextWaveCNBC. You can also send in your feedback via email to thenextwave@techcabal.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great week, everyone.